Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Literacy View. Well, you asked for it. We did it. We got Dr. Claude Goldenberg back on the show, this time to talk about English learners. He is an expert in this area, and we started the conversation the last time, but it was just too deep, too much information to cover on our other episode. So we have him back, and he has a great t-shirt on. Stop fetching and do something. And let's do it. Stop fetching, everyone. No more complaining. We got to get down to work here. So for those of you who don't know Dr. Claude Goldenberg, he is a professor of education, emeritus in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University, a native of Argentina. His areas of research and professional interest have centered on promoting academic achievement among language minority children and youth. So we are delighted to have him. His full bio will be in the show notes. And the article that we are discussing is entitled Voices from the Field: Impact of the Implementation of the Science of Reading Instruction and Policy on Emergent Bilingual English Learner Literacy Programs and Teachers. Came out in November 2024. And, Claude, when we read this over, we said, you're the person we have to have on. So usually I have a question or a comment, but honestly, I want you to kick this off, and then Judy and I will jump in. What were your immediate thoughts when you read this article, and why it's so important for people to really understand what makes sense to you and what doesn't make sense to you?
Well, Faith, let me say, first of all, I'm delighted to be back with you and Judy. This is a very fun podcast, and you ask great and penetrating questions. And it's just great to see you again. And I'm honored to be asked back and really happy to be with you. My first reaction was to quote my grandmother, "Oi, really, do you need to do this?" And then I kind of gathered myself up because, we agreed. I shout out to my wife who got me this T-shirt to remind me when I start fetching, stop it and do something. So I took a look, and let's start with where I agree with this paper and the folks behind it, the National Committee on Effective Literacy. I agree completely that state policies are, in general, and even in specific, not really adequate to address the educational, let me put it this way, are not adequate to build on the educational assets, strengths of English learners, and then adequately address their instructional needs. I mean, all children have both. All children have assets and strengths, right? They do not come as blank slates, no matter what language, color, stripe, design you are. All children have assets and strengths, and part of our educational mantra ought to be build on strengths, address the needs. No different for ELs or anyone else. And states are doing not a very good job of doing those things, building on strengths, building on assets, and addressing needs. So there's no question that nationally we need to do a better job of that. There's no daylight between us with respect to that. Unfortunately, where there's a lot of daylight is what to do about it. And that's where, unfortunately, the divergence is tremendous. And I want to put this in a positive light. I have to tell you, someone emailed me the link to this really interesting podcast, From Polarization to Progress: How to Navigate Difficult Conversations. And this was Dr. Katie Anthus, who apparently was the Commissioner of Education in Colorado. And she dealt with a very fraught political situation And it's a very interesting account of how she tried to deal with the polarization. Literally, I listened to it on my walk outside just this afternoon. And so I'm all on board with that. I mean, I think we need to do that. There's polarization aplenty in every domain of our society, now more than ever. There's always been polarization. There's never been a kumbaya period where we all agree, we get together, everyone's, but it's reached sort of an acute proportion, thank you to certain political actors who we're not going to get into right now. And it's true in the educational realm. The polarization is just sometimes hard to fathom. So I think there's a lot to be gained by trying to work together. Now, having said that, the problems that I want to point out in this study, I mean, are not, how should I say, they're not unfixable. I mean, I think doing something on voices from the field, whether it's English learner voices, whoever, I mean, we need to hear from the field. I mean, there's research on that, but this more, I would call it more informal sort of research is okay. I have no objection to it. I'm not someone who believes that unless you publish in a peer-reviewed article, a journal, I'm not interested. I mean, that's not my kind of standard. My standard is someone apparently doing a, how should I say, a reasonable effort to come up with some objective information, reasonably objective. I mean, objectivity is a fraught, complex concept, right? Your common sense is what are you talking about? So I understand it's not that simple, but someone who's trying to understand something in a relatively comprehensive but objective way. And the problem that I have with this paper is that there's no evidence of that. In fact, it's the opposite. I mean, I could have predicted the kind of things they would have come up with because they've come up with these things before, primarily that the science of reading is doing great harm to English learners. I mean, there's so many problems with that statement. I don't want to, I mean, I've been talking for too long and I don't want to keep babbling on or I'll be accused of mansplaining, which another one of my relatives accused me of, my daughter to be exact. So I'm going to try to be succinct, which is not in my nature. The problem with science of reading, as I think we talked about, is the term itself has become loaded. It's become a lightning rod. It's become fraught. It's become a cudgel that people use to beat each other with. If you're a fierce advocate of science of reading, you beat people up because they're unscientific, which means they're morons. If you think science of reading is a bad thing, then you beat people up with that because you say, you just want to teach kids phonics, right? So there's a lot of misunderstanding about what these concepts mean, what you mean when you use it, and sort of like talking past each other. And one of the big problems with this paper is sort of kind of definitional, because they talk about foundational skills, and it's not really entirely clear what's being referred to because there are different definitions of foundational skills. The 5 National Reading Panel concepts, the phonics and phonemic awareness and vocabulary and fluency and comprehension. Some people call those foundational skills. Other people, like me, for example, I'm not an example of anything, but I consider foundational skills letter sound knowledge, phonemic awareness, phonics, decoding, and fluency. Those things that connect the oral language that we talked about last time, that connect the sounds of the language to their written representations, and then connect that connection, sometimes called orthographic mapping, which is slightly different, but the same idea. Pronunciation, spelling, map it, connect it to meaning, right? Now, that's what I think of in fairly narrow terms as being foundational skills. But this kind of flip-flops around. Is it just phonics? Is it phonemic awareness? Is it also vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension? So when you ask about foundational skills, it's not entirely clear what people are responding to. So that's a huge problem. The other problem is when you talk about the problems of science of reading, that you're not really sure, and certainly there's no way to know from this paper, whether what the people that are responding, the 77 respondents they had to this survey, you don't know if they're talking about the science of reading, meaning the body of knowledge, what's been revealed. Now, I'm not talking about revealed truth, right? There's no revealed truth here. There's a body of knowledge, of data that represent, if you look at comprehensively, cohesively, the best knowledge we have about teaching reading. Is it the last word in teaching reading? No, it is not. That is the nature of science. These are not tablets handed down from on high. This is the best sense we can make of a large body of pretty complicated data that says, here's how things work in the world. Now, there's the way the world actually works, and then the way we try to figure out how it works based on the data that we collect. They're not the same thing. Ideally, you collect more data, better designed studies. And I don't mean just experiments, qualitative, ethnographic. There's all sorts of ways of collecting objective, systematic data. You collect more data that helps give you better insight into what reality is, and you get closer and closer to understanding what the truth is. So science is something that tries to approximate the truth, approximate what's out there, but it's never over. It's never over because there's always more to discover. There are always nooks and crannies and mysteries. So you don't know if people responding to science of reading are responding to the body of knowledge that they don't like, they disagree with, they think the science is wrong, or if they're thinking about the way it's been implemented in their school and classroom and in their district. And there are plenty of examples of very, very poorly implemented, science-based, science of reading aligned programs that do a tremendous disservice to kids primarily. That's what's important, but also a disservice to the science. So you can't separate those two out from this report. I got more blah blah to say, but I'm going to stop now.
So Judy just mentioned that in her, district and her understanding, it's all over the place as far as,
Don't fully throw me under the bus, but yes, all over the country.
No, yes, I'm not throwing you under the bus. I'm just saying that you were just saying that there are a lot of misunderstandings.
Horrible.
About English learners and what the science of reading means and how it's interpreted.
Yeah, it hurts my heart every day. You're right, Faith. It's a reality that it's hard to talk about because there's so many strong teams there that are getting it right in terms of the general ed population, and a lot of our ENL, of course, are general ed. But in terms of ENL, I think it's totally a mess. I see so many different things, and I see so many really passionate people that don't really have the answers, that are making decisions. And it's very frustrating because I see a lot of our English language learners aren't making enough progress, and they're getting the same assessments that our general ed kids, that are not ENL learners, are getting, and they're held to the same criteria, but their literacy block looks so different. I mean, can I just give you some examples of literacy blocks that I'm seeing? And not only in my school, just from speaking with colleagues and so forth. So some literacy blocks, you'll see the knowledge building portion in English, the writing portion in Spanish. Then you'll see small group. Some have phonemic awareness instruction, some don't have time for it. Then another model I'll see is knowledge building, meaning ELA program in English, then the same exact ELA program in Spanish, which doesn't teach the foundational skills. It's more of like learning skills and standards, and then very little time to learn how to read in English or in Spanish. And yet these kids are being held to the same standard, right? They're still taking the same universal screeners that everybody else is, which is kind of frustrating, right? If kids are just learning the English language and now they're being given, I know a lot of our viewers have probably seen universal screeners, even like one like Acadians, which I'm passionate about, but those passages are really, really complex. So we know it's crunch time and we want to get these kids reading. And many of them are nowhere near reading in English or in Spanish or in other languages. I mean, I'm bilingual myself, so this is really interesting. I speak Russian, although I was born in Brooklyn. My parents are from Riga, Latvia. I'm first generation American, but my education looked very different. And I don't know what's right or wrong. When my parents came to this country, they were all about, okay, you're going to learn the English language. You're not going into any ENL, ESL. You're going to become all American. You're going to learn English as fast as possible. And quite frankly, that's kind of what happened for me. And was that wrong or right? I don't know. I do speak Russian. I learned it. I don't know how to read and write it. But I'm fully bilingual, and I know a little bit of Spanish as well. But what's the right approach? It's really frustrating. It's scary. The ENL teachers in New York City, they call it ENL, English as a New Language. It used to be ESL, then they changed it to ENL. You wake up in the morning and it has another name, but nobody knows what they're doing. So I need some help, Claude. And I know on the last episode I wanted to drive you nuts a little bit. I tried to get answers, and you were like, Judy, no kvetching today. We're gonna dig deeper into this conversation a different day. So
Judy, I wore this t-shirt for you. Well, okay, so I don't want to be evasive again, but I think I said this last time, I'm not sure, but I'm forgetting a lot of things these days, but I'm not going to fetch about that. We got to talk about English medium instruction, which is what most English learners are in this country, and bilingual education instruction. I am delighted to talk about either one of them, but we have to make a distinction, because a lot of times they get kind of conflated and people are talking and you don't know what they're referring to, because they are very different.
You know what? You're right. Let me just chime in. So the model that I was referring to right now, that I see the biggest struggle with, is the bilingual model.
Okay. So a couple of things about. Okay, so we're going to talk about bilingual education now. I feel like there should be a sign saying we're talking about bilingual education. So couple of things. I'm going to just sort of top line. First of all, let me just make it clear, in case there's any doubt about this. I'm a big fan of bilingual education. When I used to have this conversation with my dad, because I'm from Argentina, as you know. I was born in Argentina. I came to the United States. If I'd come, half a century later, more, I'd be an EL or something. Well, there wasn't that. There were no ELs at that time. Plenty of immigrants and plenty of kids trying to figure out what's going on in school. That's always been the case. But there was no EL. There was certainly no bilingual education, unless I was in Miami. But no, there wasn't bilingual education in Miami until the 60s, till the Cubans, came over. There was probably some before then. Anyway, my dad would say, what is all this bilingual education stuff? Kind of typical immigrant, like your parents, right? He said, you didn't have bilingual education. You turned out basically okay. So I had to tell him about the theory of bilingual education, how you can learn two languages. And if you learn two languages, and he said, well, you learn two languages. My mom taught me to read in Spanish. So I came to kindergarten or first grade already speaking in Spanish. And there's tremendous transfer value. I knew how to read in Spanish, and learning to read in English was relatively easy. It might have been easy anyway. I don't know. I'm just a case of one. But I had a world-class bilingual education thanks to my parents. Now, not all kids, particularly the kids from certain areas where the low socioeconomic level is pretty low, have that advantage. But schools can make a contribution to bilingualism and biliteracy if they chose to. And they can do that by doing long-term bilingual education. That's, I think, where the greatest chance for optimal outcomes in terms of bilingualism and biliteracy. Because the research that's been done so far has found that if you talk about short-term bilingual education, which is what most kids, if they're in bilingual education, it's short-term. It's called transitional. So they learn to read and write in their home language for 1, 2, 3 years. And then once they get to a certain level of Spanish, or first language, mostly Spanish, but it could be any language, first language literacy, and a certain level of English oral language proficiency, they transition over to English, and then it's all English all the time. There's no goal, no pretense of bilingualism. There might be some lingering bilingualism and biliteracy there, but that's not really the goal. The goal is to use the first language because it's seen as some disadvantage of some sort. Bilingual education originally 50, 60 years ago was considered a compensatory program, right? Compensatory for poor kids who didn't speak English. We've got to think about a bilingual education as an enrichment program, and not just for English learners, for normal people, right? who just speak English, and they're abnormal because in the world, the rest of the world, bilingualism is a given. We are rather unique in the in the world that we're so militantly monolingual. I mean, that is a fact. So when I think about bilingual education, I don't think about it just for English learners. I think about it for everyone. It should be part of our curriculum, just like math, science, social studies, whatever. But in order for that to really lead to bilingualism, biliteracy, you need it over the long haul. It's very difficult to become bilingual, biliterate in just 2 or 3 years of a bilingual education program. I never say never. My dad always said, never say never. I never say never, but highly improbable. And there's some pretty good longitudinal studies, one in particular, done by some colleagues at Stanford, who found that over the long haul, even though in the early years, up through, say, middle school, if you're in an English-only program, you reach English proficiency more quickly. By the time, if you keep it up through middle school, by the time you're in 7th and 8th grade, the lines cross. And if you're in a long-term bilingual education program, the reclassification, the English proficiency rate is the same and eventually gets better. And by the end of high school, if you're in a long-term bilingual education program, you have much more likelihood, about 7% greater likelihood of becoming English proficient than if you were an English only or in one of those short-term programs. So that's what I think we should aim for when we talk about bilingual education, long-term with the goal of bilingualism and biliteracy. So once you get that kind of straight, then a lot of things not necessarily fall into place, but the questions that come up are different. They're like, how do you maintain it? What kind of infrastructure do you need? What kind of teaching force do you need? And importantly, what kind of political support do you need in your district? Because it's always a very hot political issue until people start seeing results. And until middle-class people start deciding, some have already decided in some districts that I've seen, that bilingualism is a good thing for their kid. And they apply political pressure to the Board of Education, to whoever, to have bilingual education, not a short-term transitional thing, but a long-term thing, because it's an asset to their kids. So that's how you can seed it and get it politically sustainable. But it's challenging. You need people, you need infrastructure, you need training, you need staff, you need stability. So it's a challenge. But that's the way we need to go if we really want to make bilingual education work for bilingualism and biliteracy. Now, having said that, when it comes to literacy, we need a completely different way of teaching literacy in the bilingual education space, because the way these kids are taught in most bilingual programs is just not consistent with the best knowledge that we have. But I'm talking here, and this is a different topic. So, Judy, did I in any way answer your question, or did I evade it once again?
I'm still confused.
Ask me another question.
I'm confused.
I'm confused also. I'm with you on this. Not that you didn't answer the question, but I think you left the door open, Claude, for now what? So, I think what I'm hearing you say is, let me just try to sum up so far what we have. You're saying that our understanding of SOR for English learners is inconsistent at best, right? And that from what you see happening in the schools, because there's this misunderstanding about what SOR is and how this can be applied to all children, people are interpreting it in all different ways, and therefore instruction is all over the place, like with what Judy had said. And your answer to that was that bilingual education should start early and be the long-term goal over the course of many years. And it's an advantage rather than looking at it as just something extra, that all kids can benefit from this. Is that so far?
Absolutely. 100%. I'm not, you know what, Faith, I'm not going to talk anymore because you got it exactly in about 10% of the words.
No, but I'm just trying to wrap my head around this.
Yeah.
So now the next step, Claude, is what should schools be doing in terms of teaching reading, and how do they look at their time, their literacy block, and work with the science of reading in terms of the phonics instruction, where it's not this misunderstanding that it's phonics, phonics, phonics all day long. And yet we know that oral language obviously is important, but you
Faith,
still
Faith, I need to chime in, but Faith, I'm seeing exactly the opposite. I'm seeing not enough attention to phonics. I'm seeing the ELA portion where they're just doing read alouds and learning standards and skills, and
right. So
enough attention.
I agree with you. So I'm asking the expert, I'm asking Claude, how do you look at this block of time? What should it look like? And if you could just spell it out for teachers, for administrators, because there is a real disconnect
Yeah,
that I
absolutely.
think if you could tie up those pieces.
I will try. So let me ask you a clarifying question to either Judy or Faith. You want me to talk about it when you're teaching Spanish reading or first language reading, or when you're teaching English reading to English learners, or both? I can do both.
I think, so Judy's saying both.
Okay.
I think both also, but let's start off with the child whose native language is not English. Let's start with that child.
Right. No, that is the only child I'm thinking of right now. Right now in our conversation, that is who we're talking about.
Okay.
But still, the child whose native language is not English, if he's in a bilingual program, he or she is going to be taught to read in his first language, and at some point will be taught to read in English. So that's the universe that we're talking about, exactly the child that you defined. And if they're in a bilingual program, they will be in both situations. If they're in an English-only program, they'll only be in the latter situation, where they'll be taught to read in English only. So do you care in which order I take it?
No.
No. Okay. So let me talk about English first, because that's where most kids, even if they're in bilingual education, they will be learning to read as they're learning to speak and understand the language. That is the fundamental feature, characteristic, attribute that teachers have got to keep in mind. You're learning to read and write in a language, you're simultaneously learning to speak and understand. Now, it could be that you're learning to read for the first time, because if you're in English medium instruction, you're learning to read in English for the first time. You don't have any literacy skills, in your back pocket. So let's say a child is learning to read in English for the first time in an English medium instruction. The kind of instruction that child needs is, on the one hand, exactly the kind of instruction that an English-speaking child needs. They need to understand the letters and the sounds they're connected to, right? We call them graphemes and phonemes. They need to understand phonemic awareness, that the words in the language can be parsed into individual sounds, aka phonemes. You have to understand that so that you can connect a grapheme to a phoneme. They need to understand and use letter sounds to decode words, using sound symbol mapping to come up with a plausible pronunciation for the word. They need to develop automaticity, accuracy, and fluency in those skills. Now, as they're learning those skills, which everybody needs to learn, right? As they're learning those skills, they also need to be learning the oral language, the English sounds and meanings of the words. Now, there are two reasons for this. First of all, they need to be learning English, period, punto, as we say. They need to be learning English in an English-speaking environment. I don't know anyone who would actually argue that they don't need English. But they also need to learn English to support the learning of the literacy. Because if you'll remember, I don't know if we talked about it last time, but there's this reading circuit that goes on in the brain that connects the sounds of the language to the written representation, to the meanings of the words. Think about one of our favorite concepts, orthographic mapping. The pronunciation gets mapped to the spelling, right? The sound gets mapped to the visual of the spelling, and then that mapping gets associated with meaning, okay? Guess what? If you don't know the meaning of the word, you can't do that. I mean, that's like a behavioral representation of what needs to happen in your brain. Sound, symbol, meaning. If you don't know the meaning, how can you make that connection? The correct answer is you cannot. So as you're learning to decode, you need to learn the meanings of the words that are being used to teach you decoding skills. The decoding skills that 5, 6, 7-year-olds learn are using words that are already in their vocabulary or in their lexicon, as scientists say. It's already in their working vocabulary. You don't have to teach them the sounds and the meaning of the words. I mean, absent developmental anomalies, et cetera, et cetera. If they're normally developing 5, 6, 7-year-old English speakers, to learn to read, all they have to learn, all in quotation marks, is the orthography, the spelling system, because they know the sound system that connects to, and they know the meaning system that connects to. If you're learning the language, you've got to learn the sound system and the meaning system as you're learning the orthography, because that's the, sometimes I call it a 3-legged stool that you need to sit on if you're going to read. You got to map the sound to the symbol, thence to the meaning. And that's the difference between teaching English learners to read than in comparison to teaching an English speaker to read. It's just harder to learn to read in the language you're simultaneously learning. I mean, it's just simple and complicated as that. Add to it that English, I just read today, I didn't realize this, English is by far the most complex orthography in the world. I thought it was in a group of complex orthographies, Russian and other strange languages. No, I just read semanticists, linguists have agreed that English is the most complex orthography. So you add that to the stew and mix it up, and you got a challenge for the kids. And if it's a challenge for the kids, guess who else it's a challenge for? The teacher. So that's the story. And then the same idea carries through as kids go from beginning to early readers to intermediate to more advanced. You've got to continue to provide support in the phonology of the language, because as you read more advanced words, there's additional phonology that you don't get early on. Think about those scientific terms, and then you get some Latin and some Greek and weird stuff that you got to make sure the phonology becomes familiar to them, as well as semantics. And the semantics, the meaning gets more complicated because it involves syntax. It involves morphology. It involves even discourse.
So who's responsible?
Teachers and schools and programs.
But I mean, is it the ENL teacher, EL teacher?
Okay.
Is it the reading teacher? Is it the classroom teacher? Because that's another, monster. Who is responsible for what? And is there crossover? Is there collaboration? That's a mess too.
Yeah, absolutely. And the answer is yes to all of the above. And I realize it's very glib and easy to say, but another cliche is it takes a village. Well, it takes a school, and it takes a team of teachers to provide the services and the support that kids need. And it takes an administrator to help make sure that is facilitated. I mean, I don't say this glibly and easily saying, oh yeah, it's everybody, because it's a tough haul. I mean, it's hard to create programs and create agendas and schedules so that people can do the kind of together work that is necessary. Because Faith, you're absolutely right. I mean, different people have different domains of knowledge, expertise, and what they're comfortable with. So I could say, just theoretically, I mean, it's easy to say all sorts of things theoretically. Theoretically, the teacher should be responsible for the in-class literacy, the teaching of reading, which is traditionally what a teacher does. Now, of course, we also know we have reading specialists. We have reading labs for kids who need additional work. So right there, you've got to connect with someone else when kids are having some degree of difficulty. Well, when it comes to kids learning to read in a language they're learning to simultaneously understand, you need someone else to provide some support. It could be the ENL teacher, it could be the, whatever you call it, ENL, ESL teacher, the EL specialist or whatever. They need to be equipped with the knowledge and the tools to assist the classroom teacher, who should have some knowledge and tools of their own. I mean, they should not be ingenues here, sort of floating in space until some specialist comes in. But the specialist should have the more specialized knowledge of how the language that is being learned needs to support the literacy that is being learned. Because it's not just a question of writing sort of general English language development, you know, ELD, ESL, whatever we're calling it these days in your schools. I mean, that's very important. Kids need to have a very general sense of language and all of its features. But what I'm talking about is very specific to literacy, so that you're providing the English language development support that supports the literacy development, such as providing the vocabulary understanding so that kids are decoding words, they can connect that to meaning. They're not just memorizing grapheme and phoneme associations. Now, who provides that instruction? Well, early on, the teacher should provide that instruction, but the teacher is going to possibly need some support from an ESL specialist who either pushes in to provide that support or suggests some lesson plans. One of my complaints about the programs and the materials that exist is they don't have enough of that kind of stuff wired in, right? When you look at some of the, I don't want to name programs because I don't want to get, you know, in trouble, certainly, or offend anyone. But there are a lot of English basic skill programs that are very popular, very successful, but don't do enough to provide just in time and online and at the moment needed support for English learners. The vocabulary they're going to need, the morphology that they're going to need, the syntactic structures they're going to need, that need to be coordinated with the literacy instruction. Presumably your ENL specialist would have that kind of knowledge about how literacy and oral language need to be taught in a coordinated way, in addition to providing ESL more generally about all sorts of things, zoos, going to school, going to church. I mean, that's all important, general ELD curriculum. But there's a certain type of ELD that is directly aimed at supporting the literacy development. That's the part that I'm talking about. And it's a tall order to ask a teacher to provide all that, to have all that kind of professional and technical knowledge to be able to provide that. And the need for additional support from additional specialists that coordinates with the classroom teacher, I mean, to me seems, very obvious, at least theoretically. Now, practically speaking, pragmatically, getting the personnel and getting the timing right and getting the coordination is not trivial, but that's what you need to aim for. I mean, it's kind of like a team approach, people who provide particular levels of support for things that they're particularly suited and equipped and trained to do. Does that answer your question, or am I just sort of spinning off here?
No, I'm starting to try to wrap my head around this. So, Judy, did you have that type of training? You have a degree, I believe, in ENL, right? So,
Do you want to know the truth?
well, yes.
I don't.
Do we have a choice?
I don't. They did not provide a lot of training. It was very easy to get the certificate. I found the shortcut, and I was a reading specialist in the morning, which I was very well trained in, but the other portion, absolutely not enough training. But I'll be honest, I'm still very confused. So, Claude, let me ask you like a couple of little short questions. Okay, you have a first grade kid. Their first language is Spanish. They come into first grade. What is the goal for the end of the school year? That they learn to read in Spanish, that they learn to read in English, or that they learn to read in both?
But Judy, I'm sorry, it depends on whether you have a bilingual program or an English only program. Oh, okay. Well, if you're in a bilingual program, then there are a couple of options, and there's no research that I know that'll actually help adjudicate this, because there are different kind of models. Let's talk about short-term bilingual education for the moment, just because that's the most prevalent.
Because that's what I see. It's
exactly.
A short term. The goal, And what I'm seeing, the theory from the people that claim to be specialists or whatever, and they very well might be, I don't know.
Yeah, I know, I understand.
Their theory is they try to explain it to me this way. They say, Judy, if they learn to read in Spanish, they'll very quickly pick up English. But I'm not seeing that happen. And then my heart starts to break because I know that they're with us for a very short window of time, right? K-5 goes by like this. And I'm very afraid to let these kids out of my care as non-readers, whether it be in English, Spanish, or both. So
right.
yeah.
So you teach in a bilingual, in a transitional bilingual education program.
I see that. Not my class, but we have many of those. I support many teachers who have that type of classroom.
Okay,
Yes.
a short-term bilingual education program. So just tell me I'm not trying to avoid the question, but so tell me what is the expectation? I mean, what's the model the school uses? First, we learn to read in Spanish, and then we transition over to English. Is that the model? What is the model?
I'm not quite sure, but what I'm seeing is that we want the kids to learn how to read in English by the end of the school year. Because this is what happens with the universal
By the end of the school year,
years.
meaning first grade?
Hopefully, or whatever
That's
grade
good.
they're. I don't even know. I'm going to tell you, I'm embarrassed to say this on the air. I don't even know. Listen, at the end of the day, this is my responsibility. My responsibility as a coach is to make sure that all K-2 kids come out readers, right? We're given one screener for all kids. We're told we can only give it, and this is from guidance from periodic assessment. We're told that these kids, if they're non-English speakers and they've been in the country less than 5 months, you could administer the screener in Spanish or a different language. If they've been here more than 5 months, you're holding them to the same standard. So that's very, very confusing. And I'm happy I'm talking about it because I know that tons of our listeners are going to know exactly what I'm talking about. And it's like the elephant in the room that everybody's afraid to talk about except me.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's an incoherent mess what you're describing. I mean, no diss to your school, but it just seems like there's no
It's not just
understanding.
my school, Claude. It's everywhere. It's
Yeah,
everywhere.
or whoever I'm referring to. I don't mean to, diss our colleagues and so
And
forth.
it's hard because this is what ends up happening. You feel like a shitty coach because you want your data to move. And, schools are looking at these little pie graphs of how kids are moving. And a lot of the bilingual kids, they're making progress. And you see the pathways on an oral reading fluency are lighting up blue. So that means good instruction is happening in the classroom. But the principals aren't looking at the pathways of progress. They're looking at the bar graphs of red, yellow, green, and blue. And unfortunately, a lot of our bilingual kids are having trouble in those type of settings meeting the quote unquote standard. And it's very frustrating it's frustrating for me. It's frustrating for the teachers who feel like they're not being successful. And it's frustrating for the kids because they're getting a mixed message too, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And it's like a smorgasbord.
I mean, it sounds to me, based on what you said, and I've trotted out my pro-bilingual education qualifications, right? So it sounds to me like there's no bilingual education. It's a pretense. It's just a pretense from what you're saying. There's no bilingual education going on there. It's a mishmash. That's what you're saying. Yeah. I mean, it's like, if you're having bilingual education, then at a minimum, you want to teach kids in their first language to read at least, like, say, give it 2-3 years. K1, 2, 3. I mean, at least that was when I taught in a transitional bilingual program, which, believe me, was no great shake. So I'm not advocating it, but at least it was more coherent. I mean, at least there was a common understanding of what we were trying to do, which is kids would be in English and Spanish reading. Kids in the bilingual program were in Spanish reading, and they got Spanish reading instruction of a certain sort, not particularly good, but they got Spanish reading instruction while they got English language development and content area times of the day. And there were a series of assessments. And when they reached a certain level of Spanish literacy, reading proficiency, and a certain level English oral language development, then they were like tested for transition, and they made the transition to English instruction. Did it work great? Was it a great program? No. We made some progress. We did some things to improve it. So, but at least that was a coherent model. At least everyone understood, like what I just said.
That's interesting. So how much English instruction did those kids in that model get during their literacy block? Was there anything in English going on?
No, because we had an ELD period, an English language development. There was a block of English language development and instruction.
What did that look like?
Well, we used Distar English. And then when everybody said, oh, we're tired of Distar English, it's boring, they brought in another kind of Sesame Street English. And then everybody started kvetching because at least Distar English taught something. And this other thing they brought in was a mishmash of nada, nothing but this.
Can you give a little bit of specifics, like so that all of our viewers get like a little bit of what that looked like a little bit like
which one, the Distar English or the other one?
The Distar.
Well, Distar is, I'm sure you all know, but I mean, you know what Distar is, right? Direct instruction.
Yeah.
And it was very structured. It taught vocabulary. It taught basic syntax. We had a book that we used. It was very scripted. We would say, everybody, this is a boy, point to the boy. And you'd like click or give some kind of signal, like training SEALs, for example. And that's the way it was kind of ridiculed. And the kids would point to the boy and you say, this is a boy. Everybody say that with me. This is a boy. And the kids would say, this is a boy. Now,
but it worked.
Well, it got, I was just about to tell you that the upper grade teachers really liked it, because by the time kids got in 5th and 6th grade, they were talking zoology, they were talking scientific concepts, because it built very systematically.
Mm-hmm.
It has a database. I mean, it has a research base that supports it because it's a very systematic, cumulative approach to teaching things. There's Distar reading, there's Distar math. We use Distar English language development. And then a few years later, people decided, oh, this is boring. We want to use something more creative.
Right.
I begged the superintendent.
It was
I begged the superintendent not to go whole hog and let me do a little pilot study. Not interested. Next thing I know, teachers are complaining because, Faith, like what you said, well, at least with Distar, they were learning something. And this other program, which is like pictures and talk about it and all this Sesame Street characters. Judy, did I answer your question? At least one.
So what I'm taking away, and listen, my teachers in the bilingual programs probably understand it way better than I do. I have so many fish to fry in the building that I can't even wrap my head around everything. I have a lot of pressure on my plate, and there's other coordinators that are managing that portion, but I still feel invested, right? These are still my kids. So I have to understand it a little bit better. And the sad part is there's not always that time for everybody to be, in schools. Everybody's like, we're working so hard to get kids to read. But this is my main takeaway right now. And I might be wrong. Faith is really good at listening. I'm not as good at listening, but I'm going to try to see what I interpreted. So you're basically recommending, and I see this happening now, by the way, in my school. They're doing this model now. I think they're shifting to what you're saying. Focus on the native language first in teaching those kids how to read. Give it 2 to 3 years where they really grasp the language and grasp it well and are fluent in it. And then transition into learning how to read in English. Yes?
Well, I think that would be better than what you're doing now, because at least there'd be some coherence to it. Is it the best option? Maybe, maybe not, because the record.
Oh no!
I'm sorry, Judy. I swear to whoever you pray to, I wish I were knowledgeable enough about what the real world is, rather than filtered through research, is how I know a lot of it. There are no easy answers, because this short-term bilingual education has kind of sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It kind of flips around. So I would definitely do what you suggested, that I suggested, because at least it's coherent. At least people understand what you're trying to do and what you're aiming for.
So just teach how to read in Spanish, teach how to write in Spanish. What about the knowledge building portion, also in Spanish?
Well, it could be. I mean, again, there are these different models.
But you don't have to do the English HMH and then the Spanish HMH in one day. That's crazy, right? That's crazy. The kids are listening to the same Meshuggah lesson twice.
Yeah, that is Meshuggah. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so I'm right that it is crazy, because it makes me nuts. And I'm
Yeah.
like, oh my God. See, but I've been fighting for the wrong thing. I've been fighting for that to stop, but I've been fighting for the kids to learn how to read in English. But
Yeah.
now I can take a step back and breathe, because I know they're doing things like Aprendo Leyendo. I finally figured out what that is.
Yeah.
Where they're
That's a good
learning how to
program.
read.
That's a good Spanish reading program.
Very good. Very
Yeah.
good. But they're also doing PAF.
And that's a good English. That's a good.
Right.
Those are
But
both very good. I know those programs well. I know the CEO of that
But
company
is
very
it
well.
the right thing to do? I know the great people. I know her too now. So is it worth doing both? Or, hey, let's do Aprendo Leyendo first, the Spanish portion, and then we could go to PAF? Or is it okay to do a Bisila or a little bit of Aprendo Leyendo and PAF, and we all live happily ever after?
Okay.
I'm asking all the hard questions today.
No,
Faith, I'm
no,
not.
it's okay. But Judy, it's fine. I mean, and you're asking hard questions. I mean, we need to ask hard questions. We can't shy away from them and pretend they don't exist. So don't apologize. But there's some models that do dual language, simultaneously. So kids are learning to read in Spanish and kids are learning to read in English, right? At the same time. Different times of the day, but the same time. There is some evidence for that. It's hardly definitive and slam dunk. It's good that you have programs that are based on the same pedagogical principles. That's a good thing. I mean, if it didn't, it would be, yeah.
All
So
right,
that's a
I'm liking
positive.
what you're saying. I'm
Yeah.
liking what you're saying. This is the direction we're moving in, so it sounds like we're going into
But
a
it's got
better
to, but
space.
Judy, again, I would emphasize, it's got to be coherent. I mean, people have to have a general understanding what they're doing and agreement on what we're trying to accomplish and how we're going to judge whether we're making progress. And it sounds like there's too much,
So,
by the seat
Claude,
of the
let me
pants.
ask you something else. Claude, did you make a roadmap? So somebody Faith probably has her own roadmap in her head. She's always 10 steps ahead. But do you have like a roadmap, like choice 1, choice 2, plan B, and then, so you know what I mean? Where would I go? Say tomorrow I want to be better informed. Where would I go? What would be my next step?
Informed about what exactly?
Which route we're going to take? My school made a decision already. You see, it's going in a better direction now. I just told you, Aprendo Leyendo and PAF. But how does a school make an informed decision?
Okay.
Because, like you said, there's a couple of options.
Yeah. Okay. Well, here's what I'd suggest, because I don't like giving not gratuitous, but kind of glib advice. What I would do, because they have very good trainers, the people working on these programs are, from what I've seen, are very good trainers. In fact, just little footnote here, we're trying to start a dual immersion structured literacy program in Southern California that's going to use these programs for dual immersion, right? English, Spanish, 2 language groups, both learning to read and write in 2 languages. And that's the program we're using, those. So what I would suggest is talk to the program people, the trainers or whatever, and sort out with them if you're going to do both simultaneously to all kids or sequentially. That's the other alternative. Talk to them about how best to put that together, because they know the program. There is a cost involved in teaching 2 languages literacy at the same time, because you got to devote like an hour to each or 45 minutes to each. And people say, what about everything else? That's a good question. So that would argue for a sequential approach, that first you do it grades 1, 2, and 1, 2, 3 in Spanish, and then gradually, as they learn more English, transition over to English. I mean, both are plausible, but I would talk to the program people to help you put together a coherent model for implementing this with those two possibilities. And there could be others that I don't know about. It's either sequential or parallel, simultaneous. Those are the two options that I know about. And I'd want to talk to the program people to put together a coherent program to move that forward.
Well, Claude, going back to this article, right? Wait, well, I'm trying to tie this in.
Sure.
So it looks as though, their understanding, at least the way it was written, was that they think that SOR is really taking away time from the language piece. Is that what you got from this? That's how I read it. That, it's almost like, this SOR is a negative and it's taking away time from kids, these English learners, because they're not getting enough vocabulary, they're not getting enough writing, they're not getting enough language development, and they're being given just foundational skills. And so I would like to clarify the message here for people who might have read this and they're wondering, oh yeah, is this correct? Not correct? This doesn't make sense to me. Oh yes, it does make sense to me. That's what I see. What's the last word on this?
NCEL is opposed to SOR, science of reading.
Mm-hmm.
They have a rock bottom assumption that science of reading is not only not for English learners, but it is harmful to English learners. That's their bottom line assumption. Everything they do flows from that. Everything. It can get masked because they'll say, yeah, we think foundational skills are important. We think decoding is important, but it's got to be in context. It's got to be part of a bigger. From what I can tell, Faith and Judy, it's a lot of window dressing. They see science of reading as antithetical, harmful to the goal of educating English learners. I think, honestly, not to dismiss, but that's all you need to know. Because everything they do and everything that I've seen and everything they write is aimed in that direction. So, we can point out specifics here. Some of the anecdotes from teachers, that what teachers complained about. I have no doubt that the things they talk about, report the teacher said. I have no doubt that teachers are reporting truthfully, but we don't know the source of that. We don't know if someone's misinterpreting science of reading, someone's implementing something that is cockamamie under the guise of science of reading. We don't know if there was insufficient training. We don't know the reason for the complaints of these teachers. And I'm not doubting the complaints at all. There's plenty to fetch about in our schools, plenty. But you got to do what this report does not do, which is dig down and see what is the source of the problem. It's not SOR that you write in the sky. SOR is coming for your EL. Everybody run. SOR is coming for your children. That's what they do. And it pisses me off because, thank you. It's such a disservice to the children that presumably they're championing. Terrible.
So let's separate this into BS from the real thing. All right. I want to know what's the BS bottom line here. Like what for kids where English is not their first language, what are the BS practices out there that teachers, administrators should know? It's a bunch of nonsense.
Under the guise of science of reading, you mean?
Correct.
There's a bunch of nonsense that doesn't come from science of reading.
Well,
okay.
Let's hear it. Let's know so that.
Okay. Under the guise of science of reading, the nonsense is, I'll give you a list of nonsense. The nonsense is you do phonemic awareness instruction and don't worry about whether the kids understand the words that you're having them phonemically segment and blend and do things with. Just phonemic instruction, phonemic awareness, just like anybody else. When you're doing decoding, just make sure they memorize the letters and sounds, and then they can combine them to decode words. Don't worry about if they know the words. Don't worry about that. And don't let them read anything until they have phonemic awareness and they have decoding. Don't let them read anything. And once you do let them read anything, once they have phonemic awareness and know all the letter sound combinations, then make sure it's only decodable texts. Only decodable text. That's all they can read. And make sure they read accurately, word for word, because you want them to be fluent. You want to be fluent. You want to be automatic. So hit those foundational skills: phonemic awareness, letter sound knowledge, decoding, phonics, and make sure they got that.
And so what I'm hearing is there are people who will not teach kids the meanings and just focus on just letter sound, correspondence, and reading words and not address the meaning. Or at least that's the understanding, that that's what's floating around. Is that correct?
Yes. And I asked Judy, is that what you see in your school?
No, we're big on vocabulary. That's one area we're really passionate
Okay.
about. We're
Well,
teaching words like squirm, and we're teaching, when we teach words with our control, we're talking about the meaning of words. That is a big part of our day. Even in the knowledge building component of the day, we're having vocabulary interactions. That's
great.
a very big part of our day.
And is that tied in with teaching foundational skills?
It's tied in throughout our entire literacy block.
Okay, great. Well, that's very good news, because what I've heard about and what I've seen in a lot of some of the classrooms is very strong on phonemic awareness, very strong on decoding, very strong on reading connected text, decoding decodable text, but very little attention to the meanings of the words or reading the text as if they have some kind of meaning, right? Reading like you're talking, with prosody. It's all about the very bottom up skills: segmenting words, putting them together, taking them apart, letter sound knowledge, decoding. Even when you get to reading text, you're reading word for word. It's like reading a horizontal list instead of a vertical list. I see that very consistently. Insufficient attention to the meanings of the words and the language that's being used to teach reading skills.
So let's say, excuse me, let's say they are doing both and they're coordinating the sound, the graphemes, the meaning. They're doing all this, and they're doing this in English, okay, for that EL student.
Yes.
So is it reasonable to say that the day could be split? Morning, let's say they get their Spanish. In the afternoon, they're getting their English. I mean, I'm looking at the whole day here. Is it reasonable to say that their day could be split morning in one language, afternoon in the other?
Yes. Yes.
But from what Judy said, they could be getting the same lesson in both languages. Now, that to me seems a little crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, it would be crazy. I mean, there are, like I said, there are all sorts of different models here, and there's very little data that I know of that would help kind of say this model works better, 50-50, 90-10. There's alternate days, there's alternate AM, PM. In general, you don't want to be repeating the same content, right? I mean, that's just a waste of time. But an alternative to doing that would be to do, if you're, say, doing social studies or science in both languages, you can do in the morning one part of the lesson in one language, and then the afternoon the next part of the lesson in the other language. I mean, the instruction would be different, because if you're doing it in the native language, you don't need to provide linguistic scaffolds or supports, because it's the kid's first language. Whereas if you're doing it in English as a second language, you need to use some model, like, you're familiar with SIOP, the sheltered instruction, sheltered strategies. Is that something? Oh, we haven't talked about those? Okay. Well, there's something called sheltered instruction. Judy, you must have heard of the SIOP, the Sheltered Instruction Observation Protocol. No?
It sounds familiar to me.
Yeah.
But I
Well, it's
don't know it in
basically
depth.
it's a model of instruction that provides linguistic scaffolds for kids who are learning content in a language they're simultaneously learning. So it's very big on, say, you have language objective and you have a content objective. You're teaching language and content at the same time. You would use a lot of graphics and graphic organizers, which are good in general. You don't need to be a second language learner to benefit from graphics and graphic organizers. But for English learners, it's probably particularly helpful, so that you're not relying entirely on the language that's coming in to understand what's going on. Now, truth be told, the evidence for the efficacy of a lot of sheltered instruction strategies is a little bit wonky. We don't have really a whole lot of evidence suggesting effectiveness. But there are strategies that I believe, there's little evidence, nothing overwhelming, that can be profitably used in order to help kids learn content that's being taught in a language, again, that they're simultaneous. That's the key thing. If you're learning content, whether it's literacy or science, in a language that you're simultaneously learning, you have to make some adjustments for that. And you can't just sort of be talking all the time like I'm doing right now. It's not good to be talking all the time anyway. But for kids who are learning the language, it's particularly bad if you're just talking all the time and not providing linguistic supports, graphic organizers, attention to the language itself as a topic that needs to be focused on, with two objectives. So you can be teaching alternating by day or by AM, PM. You don't want to teach the same content, but you can certainly teach related content, the first part of the lesson in the morning, the second part, but you'd be using different pedagogy depending on whether the lesson is in the child's home language, which he already understands, or in the second language, which requires additional linguistic support, called, sheltering, or different kinds of names associated with it.
Claude, what about for writing instruction? English, Spanish, English,
Same.
both?
I mean, same. I mean, writing, one of the not unreasonable criticisms of science of reading is just about reading. And we all know that writing, not only is writing important in of itself, but it's a complement to teaching reading. Think about reading, writing. There's decoding, encoding, there's comprehension, and then there's composition, right? So they're sort of parallel in that way. And we know that, there are plenty of studies. In fact, Steve Graham, I don't know, you should have him someday to talk about writing, because there's
We
a
did.
wonderful, oh, did you already?
Yes.
Wonderful meta-analysis where they found that if you have a balance in the sense of reading and writing, not balance in the cockamamie 3Qing way. If you have a balanced program of reading and writing, you get more bang for the buck in both domains. So writing needs to be part of literacy instruction. Okay, science of reading. I wish they'd call it science of literacy, for God's sake, but no one's listening to me.
So here's my last question. How do you tell the difference between a child who might have a language-based difficulty? You know where I'm going with this.
I do.
Okay.
Are we out of time? Sorry. Sorry.
Well, you can't get out of it. So this comes up all the time. It really does. So how do you know? Because there are kids sitting in EL classrooms and they're not getting reading help. And again, it's because there's this separation that's a misunderstanding of who teaches what and when.
Yeah.
And I think that's ultimately the biggest problem, truthfully, because we don't have enough teacher knowledge where there's crossover. But what are some of your thoughts about that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, it's a big issue for sure. So I'm not going to try to weasel out of it by saying time's up. I acknowledge it because it'd be foolish not to. I mean, people are dealing with this all the time. There are a couple of answers. One is particularly for Spanish, but yeah, mostly for Spanish. There are screeners available in Spanish and in English. And I think maybe we had this conversation last time. Doris Baker at UTA, University of Texas at Austin, has worked on these. I mean, she is very knowledgeable about this. She can talk from direct experience, developing these and using them in a way that I cannot. Lillian Duran at the University of Oregon has also a lot of experience. She's an SL speech language pathologist, has been working on this. They've developed an instrument in California called Multitudes to try to address screening issues with English learners. There's, of course, Elsa Cardenas-Hagen, who is very well known in this domain. So there are instruments being developed and are actually available that people can use if the child is not an English speaker. I know that there are ones in Spanish. I believe there are ones that have been developed in other languages, but I'm not positive. So that's one thing. You got to get the right screening instrument. In fact, there was a legislation passed in California last year requiring universal early screening. And so there are a set of potential screeners that the California Department of Education has made available. And different county offices are holding seminars and workshops introducing these different instruments. And a lot of these are sort of open to anyone who wants to attend them. So if you're interested, I can send you some links, and maybe you or your audience can attend them, because they're really quite useful. The other thing is that people need to have, teachers need to have an awareness of this. And if they have an awareness of it, then there's a chance that you won't assume one thing or the other, because people jump to conclusions. Oh, I think this child has a learning disability, or I think because it doesn't understand the language. And sometimes it's hard to tell, because sometimes these kids are not real super verbal for whatever reason. So it's very difficult. So at a minimum, teachers need to be aware is that the differences can be very subtle, and don't jump to conclusions. And there are some things that can be done, like if you know the home language, to see what kind of phonological sensitivity a child might have. So you might just informally say, like I used to play with my daughters this game, I'm going to say a word in pieces, and you see if you can put it together, right? You can guess what that is. Or I'm going to say a word, now you tell it to me in pieces. Now, if you do that in a language the child understands, and they have no idea what you're talking about, they go, okay, well then you come back a couple days later. You try to practice. You want to teach them rhymes, right? Rhymes is a good way to develop phonemic awareness, because you pay attention to similar sounds at the end of a word, right? So you want to do things that call attention to the sounds. You can talk about rhymes without getting into phonemic awareness, but that's what you're talking about. Cat, bat. Everybody say that with me. Cat, bat. They sound alike. Now I'm going to say cat and tat. So you sensitize them to the what we call sublexical parts of the word. And then you go back and you say, okay, I'm going to say a word in pieces. So there are these informal things you can do to kind of get a sense. And if the child really cannot hear, cannot segment, cannot parse, that doesn't mean they have a learning disability, but it means that they're not really being able at the moment to parse. And sometimes it takes longer to learn that than others. And if they're learning to read in a language they don't know already, then it's going to be much more difficult for them. So you can get a sense of that informally. But I think eventually you want to use a screener that more systematically assesses the phonemic awareness, the short-term memory, the different aspects that kind of go into those those things that predict potential reading difficulties. You want to do that more systematically, but you can get an idea by doing these kinds of informal things.
Judy, do you have any last thoughts, questions?
No, I'm going to save it for next time when I talk to Claude again, because he's coming back again. He's, you know what Claude is now, Faith? He's a no BS bestie. He's an
You better
official-
believe it. The next shirt you're going to be wearing, I think, is that you are a no BS bestie.
Oh, we don't have a shirt that says that, Faith.
I
That's
know.
the next one.
I mentioned that to you. We have to do it. That's one of our next projects.
Ladies, you got to get your swag game up.
I know. You know what, Claude? Faith became a grandma, and she posted a picture of her son and her daughter-in-law, and they both had merch on, and guess who did not? The baby.
Baby, we need a baby.
A onesie. A
Sure.
onesie. A no BS a no BS onesie.
Exactly.
Mazel tov, Faith. That's great. No BS onesie. That's perfect. Okay, that was worth the price of admission.
Oh my God, this has been so fun. Claude, you're the best.
You are. You are the best.
Well, you
So
are too, even though
everyone
you ask
out there-
you ask hard questions, but I forgive you because I love you both.
Well, we love you. So everyone, the message is stop fetching, get moving, start doing something to help these kids. And I think that Claude gave us a lot of food for thought.
You know what I think? Right.
Think
Faith,
about.
I'm going to interject for a second. So I think we have to hold ourselves accountable, Faith. I think based on this episode, Faith, we have to go back to our core value, which is a takeaway Tuesday. So I think our viewers, when you're going to watch this, write down what you took away. We're going to give you a format of what you need to take away. And then Faith and I, we're going to go back to Takeaway Tuesday, because the main point of the literacy view is we don't want this one and done. We want you to take something away from today and make sure it's being applied in your buildings.
And in life. And you know something, there are many people out there that say, well, this doesn't apply to me. But you know what? There are so many people in this country where English is not the first language. Of course it applies to you. You know, kids sitting in classrooms with other kids, that impacts the whole class. It really does. So everyone should care and do something about it. So thank you, Claude, for being here. We appreciate it. And we look forward to more conversations. Thank you.
Great.
And we didn't call BS on you. We didn't call BS on you. You made it out alive.
I'm so honored. Thank you both.
Okay, thank you.
Take care. Bye.